this is Vodcast 2.
Thank you, crew. We'll take it from here. Can you wave goodbye? Can you say bye? Fly away, fairy. Bye, broadcaster. Thank you, guys. All right, this is Vodcast 2, Models of Child Development. So in Chapter 2, we're talking about historical models, the 6 big theories that are used to explain child development and psychopathology. So typical child development as well as psychopathology. So some of this will be review for some of you. Okay, the complexity of abnormal child behavior requires that we consider the full range of biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors that influence children's development, right? We're very rarely talking about simplistic or linear types of relationships. Remember from other courses, you've heard of the biopsychosocial model, getting at the idea that there are multiple layers of influence that lead to both typical developmental outcomes as well as abnormal development. 3 assumptions about abnormal development. As it says here, number 1, it is multiply determined. Multiply determined. And again, that is just reiterating this idea of the biopsychosocial model in the sense that we're very rarely, if ever, talking about one variable causing some sort of psychopathological outcome. There are multiple pathways of influence that always need to be considered when we're looking at a child who has a psychological disorder. And it's often hard to be able to determine exactly what is the pathway and to consider the multiple range of influences that have led to that outcome, okay? Another assumption about abnormal development, the child and the environment are interdependent, all right? Child and the environment are interdependent. What that means is it's not just that the environment is affecting or influencing the child, it also means that the child has the power to shape his or her environment. That's known as bidirectionality or reciprocal relationships between the child and his or her environment. So just a quick example of that, you could imagine how the parenting style of certain parents could influence a child, but similarly, a child's temperament could influence the way that the parents parent that child, right? So you could have 2 siblings, one with an easy temperament, one with a difficult temperament, and even though parents might have a particular parenting style, they probably tweak things depending on the temperament of those 2 siblings. Maybe one is a much more sensitive child, so they don't have to be as strict, and maybe one is much more stubborn or something, and so they have to make some changes. So just as the environment shapes and influences the child also has the power to influence his or her environment. And the third here, abnormal development involves continuities and discontinuities, okay? Continuities and discontinuities in development. So psychopathology can be a function of continuous development taken to an extreme. If, for example, you take something normal, like a normal feeling, a normal emotion that a child could have is sadness. If it intensifies to the extreme, then you have signs of depression. So continuities, a normal set of feelings or behaviors intensify. So it might be normal for a child to count stairs or not try to step on a crack or not try to step on a line. A lot of children do that. But when that behavior is taken to an extreme level, you could then start being able to meet the criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder, for one example, okay? Or again, that sadness is normal, intensified, prolonged sadness over a long period of time could go over the line into abnormal behavior. Okay, then discontinuities, discrete qualitative differences, okay? So psychopathology that is a function of discontinuities in development could be, for example, a child who is having hallucinations or delusions, right? So that a hallucination or a delusion represents a qualitative change, something completely different entirely than what normal, typically developing children would be experiencing. All right? So a complete shift, some new or different behavior or cognition or emotion. Okay, so now at this point, we've kind of done some of the general themes of this chapter, and now, we're going to go through the 6 major categories of models that can be used to explain typically developing children as well as psychopathology. Okay, so we're going to start with physiological. Okay, physiological models. Okay, so physiological models are concerned with things like genes and the structures of the brain, neuroanatomy, neuroscience, As this little girl here is saying, there's a physiological, meaning structural, biological, or chemical basis for all psychological processes and events. Okay, that we can locate different pathways in the brain, different neurochemical pathways, different brain regions, different neurotransmitter activity, all these different physiological elements that are involved and that underlie psychological processes. Okay, so I've mentioned that physiological models are concerned with genes, gene mapping, for example. The Human Genome Project is discussed in more detail in your text, attempting to identify 30,000 genes in human DNA. The field of neuroscience involves all of these different aspects. We know, for example, that in early childhood, in prenatal development and early childhood, there's a rapid burst of synapse formation. So that's known as synaptogenesis. Many initial circuits are formed or synapses are formed. And then as you go through your life, the connections that you don't need are broken off, and that's known as synaptic pruning. There's a lot of work being done to map brain structures so that we know which brain structures are associated with faulty cognition or with extremes of emotion, things like that. We also know that some outcomes are are a function of very tight genetic control, and other things are more open to influence by the environment. Okay, so what this is referring to is some outcomes are basically happening as a result of genetic predispositions, while other things that are only loosely under genetic control would be the kinds of things where the environment can have a huge impact on whether or not that phenotype or that outward behavior is actually expressed. Okay, we also know that different parts of the brain experience different levels of growth. So some parts of the brain are done forming early on in early childhood. Other parts of the brain continue to grow and develop over the lifespan. Sensitive periods, just to remind you, if you've ever studied Jeannie, for example, and in that example, she's a wild child, and they've identified sensitive periods in language development, for example, specifically related to grammar. Sensitive periods mean if the brain is not exposed to a particular type of environmental influence, then certain cognitive functions may not ever be able to develop. So in the case of Jeannie, she was not exposed to human socialization. She was not exposed to human language. When she was found after severe abuse and neglect at age 13, they attempted to teach her language, and she learned a lot of vocabulary. Her lexical development was good, but she was not able to ever acquire a naturally human grammar. Okay, so you might have heard that term before, sensitive periods or critical periods. Neural plasticity and brain reorganization refers to the idea that there is flexibility or plasticity in our brain, so we are constantly rewiring our circuits, again relating back to that idea of synaptic pruning. We're fine-tuning the neural networks in our brain, and if there's ever brain damage, for example, neuroplasticity refers to the fact that your brain can rewire circuits to make up for any lost functions that might have occurred as a result of brain damage. Okay, so in terms of physiological models explaining why psychopathology might occur or why it might unfold, the two different views that fall from this set or family of models is that psychopathology could occur as a result of a maturational blueprint. In other words, in some cases like a really genetic disorder or a chromosomal abnormality, then you're seeing some psychopathology that is really related to that DNA blueprint sort of unfolding and leading to some sort of damage as a result of a genetic or chromosomal abnormality, like in the case of maybe severe mental retardation. The diathesis stress model is really similar to the idea of nature-nurture. Diathesis is another word for a predisposition. So in this explanation, psychopathology happens when there is diathesis or some predisposition, but the predisposition genetically is not enough to explain why psychopathology occurs. There needs to be some sort of trigger, an additional stress, and that's where the stress part comes in here. And that additional stress could be something physiological, right? Again, something like brain damage or something related to hormones, or it could be environmental, a stressful trauma that you experience. So you inherit a predisposition, diathesis, you layer on stress, physiological or environmental stress, and then the result is disorder. And that is an explanation of how psychopathology unfolds according to the physiological models. Okay, then we have our psychodynamic models here. Key players, Freud, Erik Erikson. Historically, the psychodynamic model was concerned with a variety of themes that I have up in here, right? One theme is this idea of competing agencies of the mind, the id, ego, superego idea from Freud, if you remember about that. We don't have to go into too much detail. Also, Freud and Erikson both believed that there were stages and ages, as I said here, right? Stages and ages, meaning that there were certain progression of stages that human beings and children go through, and it corresponds to particular developmental milestones that happen at each age. And specifically at each age, there is some sort of a conflict that occurs. And the idea is that a successful resolution of that conflict will lead to very good outcomes for the child. However, if there was some sort of a crisis and the child did not successfully have a resolution of the conflict or crisis, then they would sort of carry that with them as baggage throughout the rest of their lives. So if you think about things like trust versus mistrust with Erikson, if babies never formed good bonds or trusting relationships with their caregivers, they did not have a healthy resolution of that stage, and so then they sort of carried that with them in a negative way throughout the rest of their life. Okay, and the other theme historically with the psychodynamic models of development and psychopathology is that we have these unconscious processes, things that we're not even aware of, that are affecting our personality continuously. Okay, so this is a little sleepy person who's unconsciously having her personality influenced by things she's not even aware of. Also historically, with psychodynamic approaches, there was an emphasis on something called the fixation regression model of psychopathology. The idea was that some disorder that is showing now, maybe in later childhood or in adolescence, is rooted in some sort of past trauma, that maybe there was abuse early in childhood or neglect or something that happened in the earliest years, and there was no successful resolution, and again the child is sort of carrying this baggage with them now, and it's being revealed as current psychopathology. So that's fixation regression. You get fixated or you get stuck at some point in the past, typically in early childhood. Okay, then we have some contemporary themes because some of this has fallen out of favor, but there's still quite a bit of psychodynamic models that still influence treatment and diagnosis of psychopathology in kids today. So we still see an emphasis on unconscious processes affecting cognition, mood, motivation, right? People might not be aware about why they're feeling apathetic or unmotivated. They don't know, but through some type of psychodynamic therapy, you might be able to uncover what is the root cause of that feeling of apathy or lack of motivation. There's an emphasis on mental representations of the self and others. Subjective experiences are held in high regard, and they're thought to be very important. So there's no right or wrong when you're talking in terms of psychodynamic therapy. How the individual client or the child who has the psychological disorder, their perspective is considered very important, and it's validated. Okay, developmental perspective. Origins of personality are in early childhood, and that there are also age-related challenges. So this idea of stages and ages is still something that is considered in terms of contemporary approaches to psychodynamic therapy and so forth. There's also a very strong emphasis on relationships and that those early attachments that we have with our caregivers. And if there was something that went awry early in childhood, again, we're likely to see that theme be coming up later on when the child is showing symptoms of a disorder. Play therapy is another theme of this approach, and the idea is that when children are acting out scenes or doing role play with toys, that maybe that could uncover a past trauma, maybe it could uncover something that is buried in their unconscious that might be revealed in terms of their relationships with their parents or their siblings, or something that they're having a lot of anxiety about might come out in play therapy. So you see a lot of that role play happening in current treatments that take a psychodynamic approach.